So I got a funny email. Long story short, Bethesda is launching this massive new expansion for Starfield called Shattered Space, and they're looking for makers that could bring a couple of these highly detailed suits from the expansion to life. And my role in all this would be building 2 render-accurate helmets that could be worn all day, meaning some sort of thermal engineering, airflow situation happening, and all that with a generous deadline of 2-ish months from now. 2 helmets, 2 months. I guess if you're watching this video, that means I said yes. I got some reference materials and immediately went to work. Game assets don't have space for padding, LEDs, or even a human head to begin with, so I must model my own lookalike with all those features. It did take me a couple of tests to get the sizing just right. After 2 weeks of non-stop modeling, I present to you House Va'Ruun Zealot helmet. To my tired eyes, this is pretty much a perfect clone. It consists of 130 handmade parts and 68 bolts that keep them together, and it is by far my most complex design. From all the features, I want to highlight my thermal design. Since the helmets will be worn by real humans, I designed this floating plate system with tons of airflow to dissipate heat and moisture. 2 fans on top will help move the air around the head and reduce fogging from actors' breath on the visor. Speaking of which, the visor is the part that I'm worried about the most. Our eyes naturally gravitate towards faces, so that means that the visor is going to be the most looked at part, so it has to be flawless. It has these precise symmetric grooves on each side, which would make vacuum forming as a method of production very challenging. So my only shot is resin printing. The visors have this amber tint to them, so I dyed the resin with a mix of yellow and orange ink. I use the same resin to spot fill any imperfections, because these have to be crystal clear in the end. This process is much longer than I show here. I wet sand from 400 to 3000 grit in small increments, and then I use various polishing compounds to bring it to optical clarity. I do not spray any clear coat. It would make it shinier, but I'm worried that it would deposit uneven because it's such a large surface and would give a frosted glass effect instead. You don't spray lacquer on your sunglasses to make them clearer, so I just followed the same reasoning here. And man, it was such a relief to get the visor so clear, cause I didn't really have a plan B. The main shell pieces printed out just fine, even though they're quite huge, and after some dialing in, they form one continuous body for me to mount other parts to. The drawback of sci-fi armors is that there cannot be any imperfections, so I start out with a rough sanding pass and fill in the low spots with some resin. Same steps apply to all the other parts. I do a rough pass, then I fill in with resin, wet sand by hand, filler spray, wet sanding again, and then another pass of filler spray for any remaining imperfections. Sadly, this never-ending sanding and filling is just what's required for the perfect finish. There's just no way out but through. I knocked down the filler primer for the last time with some wet sanding and assembled the pieces for a test fit. Everything fit perfect and aligned well, but I came to a sad realization. The Zealot version of House Va'Ruun spacesuits that we're building feature these ornaments and symbols painted all over, and that kinda needs to be done in a single go for consistency across parts. But that means that the helmet deadline is actually a few weeks earlier before the reveal, because I need to finish the helmets and send them over to Mats5 and Miss Vane, my partners and all this that are in charge of the rest of the suits, so they could perform the finishing touches in their studio. Oof. To make it in time, now I need to work extra fast. I lay down a base coat and let it dry while I work on other things. To diffuse the light around the face, I'm going to be using these silicone diffuser tubes. They work really good. Combined with high-density LED strips, they provide a very smooth glow. I had to model the visor holder really carefully because the LED strips don't bend in all directions, so the curvature had to account for that. On the circuit board, I'm making everything modular, so in case a component breaks, you can just unplug it and swap it out. The helmets will have a removable power bank for standalone operation, but they will primarily piggyback off of the spacesuit's much larger power source, so you would not have to have all this extra weight on your head all the time. So to have this switching functionality possible, I need to add a toggle switch. Everything went okay until it didn't. Once the fans would turn on, the LEDs would just go crazy. This really freaked me out because there was no clear solution to it, and I did not have time for major redesigns. It was something to do with the motors, and I tried a bunch of things, but in the end I added so-called decoupling capacitors. Essentially a little buffer to smooth out the electrical noise, and it fixed it. It felt great to figure it out, but it took a lot of time that I didn't have. With the electronics handled, I was busy churning out the resin details. I was printing non-stop for days, and not because the prints were failing or anything, it's just that I needed that many different parts. I'm really struggling fitting the resin pieces together. Like, they're individually nice and smooth and printed out just fine, but as soon as I start to put them together, they're just slightly off enough not to fit properly together. So I guess I need to spend more time with the sandpaper and try to make stuff fit manually. I thought that resin printing the non-structural parts will save me time, but they still needed so much post-processing. You can mush non-fitting jigsaw pieces together when they're made of paper, but imagine if they were made out of porcelain. Essentially, that's why all these resin pieces had to be dialed in by hand. Resin is just not forgiving for misalignments. While the paint is drying, I'm moving on to the translucent parts. Even though I'm using RGB LEDs, the light diffusers also need to be colored, just so the helmets would look right with the power off. Since these elements are quite small, I need to add a lot of pigment so the color would stay rich. Just like before, I need to fine-tune the fitment, but this time I also need to polish the surfaces, just so they would be nice and shiny. The glossy orange pairs really well with the matte black. I modeled the helmets to help expel as much heat and moisture as possible. That's why there's so many holes and floating surfaces. This way there's a lot of airflow, even though they don't look any different on the outside. In the reference, there's this section of padded elements on the top, but instead of making them solid, I made them hollow and will wrap them in fabric to keep them breathable. Mats5 and Mistvane sent me over some fabrics that I used in the suits, so the helmets would match perfectly. I glue, stretch, and trim the fabric onto the parts. It's a delicate process as there is no space for excess fabric, but bit by bit, the pillows got wrapped and were wrinkle-free. There are more fabric parts on the helmet, and the ones that go over the ears look like they're padded, so I need to get some dimensionally accurate padding. I thought about laser cutting, but these ear donuts need to be rounded, so I built this hot wire cutter to slice the mattress foam in a repeatable way. Looking back, maybe it was a bit overkill, but I didn't want to compromise on quality. I cut some fake leather patches and glued them onto the sponge donuts. I burned some holes for mounting the resin pieces, and then I add some glue to stick down the pleather. It takes a while to massage it into place, but in the end I managed to glue it down without too many wrinkles, and I slice off the excess. The topmost fabric part will hide the worst of it, so that's what happens next. These side fabric pieces have this odd shape, wrapping around certain elements while hiding others, and a bunch of decorative stitches. They also have a bunch of black rivets, so I paint some and hammer them in. I add a thin layer of contact glue so it wouldn't bleed through and ruin everything, and carefully place them on the helmets.
Oh, this is looking so good.
Turned out just perfect. Then I move on to gluing down the LEDs and the front resin elements that I dialed in before. As the clock was ticking, we had to settle on the final colorway. We picked out a handful of airbrush paints that both me and Mats5 with Mistvane had access to, so everything would match. After getting everything as consistent as I could, I added some clear coat to seal everything up. Some other parts of the helmet had other shades of metallics, like for example this rear element had this more like copper brass color, which you wouldn't even notice, but here we are. Putting everything together felt like such a triumph. Everything slotting in perfectly, looking spot on, it was like, chef's kiss. And this is just an example of why there are so many different unique parts. I designed these lens tubes just like they would be put together if they were functional. I used the same resin as for the visor, so everything stays consistent. I assembled the stacks and glued them in place, but like I said, this is just to show that there are so many details that you wouldn't even notice, but they take hours to make. Anything for extra realism. The ear modules that go on top of the sponges we just made are also quite intricate. I modeled them to be all separate pieces, just like the reference. To diffuse and color the light from the LEDs, I'm using these orange elements that slot into the surface part and combined into this sandwich structure. And then they get bolted to the main helmet frame. Then I glue in and connect the LED elements in the front side plates. Even though the deadline was approaching fast, it was still super fun to see all these little pieces come together. There are some exposed tubes running on the surface of the helmet, so I'm using some regular wire shielding for that. I glue in some 3D printed plugs so they could be detachable to the empty hole where the wires were. I glue in this tapering, curved piece of fabric that is actually very precisely shaped. It should barely cover the gap and help with airflow. And then another fabric patch on the rear of the helmet. To make everything tidy, I print out a bunch of these wire management hooks and then I glue them inside the helmet to help route the wires to the circuit board. Meanwhile, SkyMoon helped me out with the lining. We studied a bunch of how motorcycle helmets are put together and how they help ventilation. In the end, we made the lining just as in the reference, but with these mesh wedges to help breathability, and of course, holes for the fans. The lining is detachable with Velcro, so you can rinse it out if it gets too sweaty after many convention days. Even though they're getting a bunch of paint on top, just for layering's sake I add a tiny bit of highlights so the surfaces would appear more three-dimensional and separate. And wouldn't you know it, I'm done, with time to spare. It feels weird to see all this work completed after all the weeks of crafting and thinking and stressing over deadlines and everything. I mean, I know that diamonds are made under pressure, but still, I think it will take a few days for me to process what exactly happened. But honestly, even I myself am impressed by the amount of parts required to build these. These are by far the most detailed pieces I've ever made. Oh yeah, and do you like the LED startup animation? They don't do that in the game, but I just wanted to add something of my own, you know? Now I still have a couple of days to figure out the packaging and taking some pictures and whatnot, but first, I'm gonna enjoy the fruits of my labor.
Look at me.
With the lining, they're surprisingly comfortable, and the fans are doing a really decent job at defogging the visor. But like it or not, the LEDs still steal the show. They can get quite bright, and even in studio lighting you can see them just fine. The metallic paint is such an eye-catcher, but that's the drawback of darker props. You need a lot of light to see all the details. But that's not gonna be the case for long. Time to send them off to get their final paint job.
Oh my god. This helmet is insane.
MS5 applies the final paint and weathering to the suits and helmets, and off we go to Gamescom in Cologne, Germany, probably the biggest gaming event in the world. That is where we presented our work to the world, at the Starfield booth, and judging by the response, I think people liked it. It was a bit annoying actually, because as soon as they would start posing, crowds would start forming and I couldn't get any proper footage. The helmets looked so good and perfectly in line with the rest of their amazing suits, so all of the effort in coordinating fabrics and paints didn't go to waste. While they were out spreading the good word of Starfield, I got a chance to pop by Bethesda's livestream and talk about my involvement. It was fun to shed some light on engineering and what kind of problems need to be solved in such a project. And Gamescom just flew by, just like the weeks before it. So I guess that's how you put together a simple House Va'Ruun space helmet. Easy peasy. Just kidding, it was really difficult, but we managed to pull through, twice actually. Starfield Shattered Space launches on September the 30th, so go check it out and see for yourself how close our cosplays got to the real deal. And let me know in the comments below what you thought about this whole build. Maybe there was something unexpected or something that you learned. It would be fun to hear. But that being said, thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time.